The dog days of summer are over. Months of having to spend time with families and friends is almost at a merciful end. The nights are closing in, the evenings are growing a little colder, and we all know what that means, or if you're on my channel and aren't lost, I assume you do. Hockey is just around the corner, and it's been a doozy of a summer in the world of the NHL. So what are we doing today? What's on the list? Let me have a look. A list? Oh shit. We're doing a tier list. What is this, 2020 YouTube? Listen, you all know how a tier list works. It's like a report card. You have F for, I don't know, fuck. And like all scorecards, S for, oh, I don't watch enough Asmongold or spend enough time on Reddit. I guess superb, as in superb bird of paradise. First and foremost, let's talk about what this list isn't. The grades here are not indicative of how I think individual franchises will fare this season. These are not predictions for how the season will pan out. There are teams in my bottom grade that will likely make the playoffs this season, and some teams are way off of the playoffs that have passing grades. This is because I'm ranking those ever intangible vibes, you know, how a team's vibing. But to try and qualify that, I'm looking at teams' culture and prospects charts. I'm looking at how teams may mesh with their coaching staff, the structure of teams' front offices, how franchises are trending, and ultimately the atmosphere of hope, optimism, pessimism or dread surrounding every NHL team. As such, I'm grading vibes, and obviously this is very much subjective and from the perspective of a complete outsider, which is the story of my life. To add a further caveat, I finished writing this script August 22nd. Trades are likely to be happening as I speak this sentence. I will try and keep this updated as I edit, which I suspect will be a few weeks, and that will be plenty of time for this to be wildly out of date. But guys, give me a little leeway. I've covered and researched all 32 teams. This was the work of more than a minute. Anyway, feel free to comment down below what you think I got right and who am I kidding, what I got wrong. And with that said, let's grade them. If you thought I was going to do this alphabetically, you're in for a disappointment. There was a sense of foreboding heading into 2023-24 for the Canes. While undoubtedly one of the strongest rosters in the Eastern Conference, evidenced by their president's trophy contention, several contracts were coming to an end or headed to arbitration. It seemed inevitable Carolina would be struggling to keep the band together. However, even most Canes fans would have been taken aback by the hollowing out of the roster this offseason. Jake Guentzel, the big-name deadline pickup, chose not to re-sign and became a rental. Teuvo Väinö headed back to Chicago in a theme Stefan Noesen continued by returning to New Jersey. Brett Pesce joined Noesen in New Jersey, while Brady Shea was the third big-name to head to Nashville later on free agency day. Evgeny Kuznetsov, who was one of the feel-good stories after his pickup following his troubled departure from the Caps, also ended his turbulent NHL career, returning to Russia in the summer. Worse news was to follow when Jesper Fast announced he would be out for the season following neck surgery. Fast was a fringe figure last season in Carolina, but his absence makes Carolina another body lighter. The Canes have done well to plug the holes left, but the incoming names have mostly been depth players on two-way contracts, with only Shane Gostisbehere and Sean Walker providing notable returns. This is a weaker Canes team than last year, but spots are now opening up for notable prospects. It's just too bad Nikhaishyn is still contracted in the KHL for next season, but will be nicely timed for the end of Brent Burns' contract. Rod Brind'Amour is a legendary figure in Carolina and a fine regular season coach, but Canes fans were starting to question his playoff acumen. This led to the idea that the Canes could lowball Brind'Amour, who was seen as wedded to Carolina and reluctant to uproot his family. Ultimately, Brind'Amour signed a multi-year contract extension in May, despite once again disappointing in the playoffs. I suspect much the same as last year for the Canes, however. A slightly weaker Canes side, but one that will be playoff-bound in a weak East. If things start bad, the vibes around the Brind'Amour contract will be not great, but I also doubt that will happen. The bigger question will be how disgruntled Canes fans will be with another early playoff exit. The Canes get a C for me. Expecting to enter a rebuild last season was somewhat derailed by the Flyers' unexpected wildcard chase, only to completely crash and burn when the starting goaltender was suspended, and the team fell away with Tortorella scratching Sean Couturier and accusing the team of being soft, ultimately resulting in the worst of both worlds for the Flyers. Russian giant Ivan Fedotov is expected to start in net this season. The 6'7" goalie's arrival in Philadelphia felt like the stuff of early Iron Curtain defections, and I'm sure most would like to see him succeed, but he looked rough in an admittedly small 3-game sample size, and in his defense the Flyers were in a full systemic collapse when he arrived. If the step up to the NHL proves too much, the Flyers may be forced to resort to Samuel Ersson, whose .890 was serviceable in Hart's absence, but nothing more. How much Tortorella really wants to coach a team in full rebuild is a big question. Maybe it's just me, but his shtick was wearing thin towards the end of last year. We all know the media fronting Torts is not the locker room Torts, he's a master of media manipulation. But things are likely to be a lot quieter in Philadelphia this year, and Tortorella loves the spotlight. The biggest news in preseason was the arrival of Matvei Michkov, whose relationship with SKA St. Petersburg had been decidedly icy, being scratched by the old army club before lighting up the KHL at almost a point-a-game pace while on loan with HC Sochi. The untimely death of his father means a fresh start in NHL can only be good vibes, even on a rebuilding team, as Andrei Michkov, his father, was his greatest supporter. However it pans out for Ivan Fedotov, having 2 Russians learning the North American game together will be a huge boon for the Flyers. This Flyers team will likely be one of the youngest in the NHL. The likes of Cam York, Joel Farabee, Morgan Frost and Owen Tippett have plenty of headroom to continue to develop, but questions have to be asked about what happened with Cutter Gauthier and can his replacement Jamie Drysdale stay healthy. One player who won't be playing in Philly this season is Ryan Johansson, who, let's face it, was never going to play for Tortorella, and questions have to be asked about how that trade was allowed to happen when Johansson was already injured. I expect the Flyers to be a hard watch this year with some pretty inconsistent net minding, but this is a developing team with a number of exciting pieces and a Calder candidate arrival in Michkov to keep things interesting. Don't expect the Flyers to contend, but if Tortorella can recalibrate for a rebuild, this could be a good developmental year in Philly. See vibes. Montreal had an extremely quiet off-season, but this was to the surprise of nobody. Signing up a French Canadian, albeit a borderline NHLer in Alex Barré-Boulet, was the sum of the Canadiens' free agency work through August, and a vibe signing. But the bigger news was nailing down Juraj Slavkovsky for the league maximum term and a $7.5 million AAV after the young Slovak recovered from a ropey rookie season in which he was rushed into the league to have a strong sophomore campaign. The Canadiens were the team on draft day to take the punt on Ivan Demidov. Some had Demidov as high as second, but the Russian was expected to fall due to the socio-political backdrop of drafting Russians and the ongoing complexities with the KHL contracts. Demidov had an explosive season in the MHL, but the jury is out to how good the MHL is as a test bed. Demidov has yet to make an impact in the KHL, but is expected to play for SKA this season, as he is contracted to the St. Petersburg club. Montreal has done a remarkable job turning their roster over in a rapid rebuild when compared with the likes of Buffalo, Columbus, Detroit and Anaheim. Youth is the key in Montreal, and Martin St. Louis is giving young players the chance to learn at the NHL level. Come late August, and the Canadiens finally made a splash by signing Blue Jackets one-way Patrick Laine. On paper, Laine is an interesting pickup for the Canadiens. If he pans out, he'll be a band-aid that will push Montreal forward in the standings, but comes with the risk of a player who struggled emotionally in one of the league's backwaters and now enters one of the league's teams under a constant microscope. Laine also struggled on the ice in Columbus due to the lack of compatible foils through the middle, and the Canadiens may be the next Finnish team at centre in the league, so the trade is a curious fit. The short-term pain of having one of the youngest rosters looks set to stand the Canadiens in good stead in the upcoming years, with the likes of Slavkovsky, Caulfield and Suzuki likely to be crucial parts for the best part of the next decade. The jury is out on whether Montembeault is the long-term solution in net, but the 27-year-old Quebecois has the French-Canadian sheen and has been exposed by an exceptionally young blue line still learning the pro game in front of him. If I was to have one criticism, it would be the Habs could do with a few more veterans to guide their youthful vanguard. Yet despite that, if Slavkovsky and Caulfield continue on an upward curve, and if Demidov is the real deal, this Canadiens team could be contenders sooner rather than later. This may seem left field, but I'm giving Montreal a B+. The vibes are good in the Bell Centre, and St. Louis looks a good fit for bringing in the new wave. The Coyotes finally got taken out back of the desert barn and put to sleep by a tearful Gary Bettman in the summer. Years of mismanagement came to a rapid and sudden end, in part because Ryan Smith had been caught in Bettman with his wealth, his arena, sort of, and his competence, all things Alex Morello could not offer. Fans will still decry that hockey hasn't returned to Quebec, but it'll be interesting to see how hockey in Utah pans out, especially given that Salt Lake City is only 80,000 people larger than Hartford, Connecticut. For years, Morello had used the Coyotes as an opportunity to launder LTIR contracts and buyout contracts to reach the cap floor. It's a miracle that the Coyotes were in the playoff race for much of the season, given their cap chart still had Jacob Voracek, Shea Weber, and Brian Little on it. The Utah HC ultimately entered free agency with 0 defensemen, and Smith seemed to take the shackles off Bill Armstrong, who busily built a decent defensive core of Sergachev, Marino, and Ian Cole, supplemented with RFA re-signs Sean Dursey and Juuso Välimäki. Meanwhile, the real tragedy for Yotes fans was how things were starting to come together up front with an exciting young forward core. Clayton Keller, Barrett Hayton, Logan Cooley, Dylan Gunther, and Josh Doan are all developing into an excellent top 6, and with Tage Ginla on the way as Utah HC played spoiler by snatching a Ginla from Calgary, they have yet another player that could end up being a top 6 player. Gunther in particular needs to continue being blooded in the NHL rather than bounce around between the NHL and the AHL. Connor Ingram has battled with several mental health demons to emerge as a dependable starting goalie. Whether he has the beans alone to get Utah into the playoffs is another question. He should have a more solid defense in front of him this season, depending on how long they take to gel. As for unpopular opinions, I know Utah HC is a placeholder name, but I prefer it to every other option, and at least it's different. The other names sound like they'd be more suited to the mid-90s roller hockey league. The arena looks problematic, but we always knew it would. There are many tipping Utah to make the playoffs this season. I suspect they may be a little short, but if Cooley, Doan, and Gunther kick on and Clayton Keller keeps the same form as last year, Utah will be there or thereabouts. How hockey settles in Salt Lake City remains to be seen, but this young core gives a club breathing new life a lot of hope for the future. Be vibes in Utah. Few teams have seen their stocks soar more precipitously this offseason than the New Jersey Devils. Highly touted going into their last campaign, the Devils' season imploded in front of awful goaltending, injuries to key players, and a coaching philosophy that seemed at odds to the parts Lindy Ruff had at his disposal. Fast forward a year and Vitek Vanacek has been upgraded to Jacob Markstrom, with Jake Allen in relief. Ruff has gone and has been replaced with Sheldon Keefe, who will likely benefit from a more balanced and dynamic roster than he had in Toronto, and his puck possession ethos is better suited to the Devils than the run and gun of Lindy Ruff. Dougie Hamilton, Devils' leading veteran presence on the blue line, is also set to return after missing the majority of last season. The off-season additions of Brett Pesce and Brendan Dillon, while not as eye-catching as the Markstrom pickup, are a better return than the outgoing Ball and Marino and will give the Devils better organisational depth on D, while Stefan Nason returns to the Devils after 2 solid seasons in Carolina. There are concerns that the team still needs to bolster the second line, and the Devils face cap hell next season when Luke Hughes' ELC ends, but this is a win-now team that missed the playoffs entirely last year. And this is also the last season the team will be paying Ilya Kovalchuk, despite not having played in New Jersey for over a decade. Despite how bad last season was, Simon Nemec emerged as an exciting talent, and he should find himself developing on a winning team this year. I fancy New Jersey to go from zeros to heroes this season under Keefe. It has to be A vibes-wise after last season's disaster. Julien Brisebois appears to want to be the Kelly McCrimmon of the East. The endless contract speculation surrounding Steve Stamkos' contract was nothing short of the McCrimmon school of callous roster management. A true Mount Rushmore player in Lightning history, Steve Stamkos is, after 16 years and over 1,000 games, gone and unlikely to end his career in Tampa. Few players in the current era feel as truly ingrained in the team's identity as Stamkos, but worse, his departure did not come as a surprise. And so Tampa move on without their captain. Victor Hedman assumes the role of the totemic face of the Lightning, and free agent pickup Jake Guentzel will be expected to fill in the offensive hole left by Stamkos. And playing alongside 2-time Art Ross winner Nikita Kucherov is sure to benefit Guentzel. While Stamkos stole the headlines, the trade which saw Mikhail Sergachev depart to Utah made the Lightning back end weaker. Sergachev had an injury-riddled season, but the Russian is just 26. His replacement, 24-year-old JJ Moser, isn't at the same level as Sergachev at his best. To that end, Tampa also picked up Ryan McDonough, who won't put up Sergachev-esque offensive numbers, but is a rock-steady top-4 defenseman. Girgensons and Cam Atkinson will add some depth character, but if the aim when dumping Stamkos was to get younger, they're slightly odd pickups. Connor Geekie is an exciting component of the Sergachev trade, likely to fight for a place in the NHL during camp. Vasilevsky entering the season fit with a full preseason behind him should be a boon for the Bolts, who had to lean on Johansson out the gates earlier last year, and his .890 isn't great even in relief. Checks and balances wise, even with Stamkos and Sergachev gone, the Lightning feel like they've moved laterally, but the core and additions like McDonough and Atkinson are aging. The Lightning will continue to compete and will most likely make the playoffs, but the best years are behind them for now, and the loss of Stamkos for nothing feels poignantly indicative of that. I'm going to give Tampa a D+, because this is a team headed towards a rebuild. The Ducks are a funny team. There are those that believe Anaheim are on the cusp, and others that think the Duck boat still has a lot of turning to do. Either way, you'd be forgiven for forgetting the Ducks existed the last couple of years. A 6-game winning streak in the early salvos of last year gave Ducks fans reason to hope, but much like the year before, the Ducks soon sank into Western Conference obscurity. The acquisition of Cutter Gauthier is an improvement after he strong-armed his way out of Philly. Man of Glass Jamie Drysdale went the other way, and the Ducks already have a solid core of decent prospects on the blue line. Word was Verbeek took a number of swings at free agency and whiffed on every single one, and Vetrano and Zegras continue to garner trade talk as a result. Questions will be asked why Verbeek didn't trade down on draft day when they seem wedded to Beckett Seneke and took him off the board surprisingly early. The Ducks still don't seem to know what they have in Vetrano as he flourishes in a forgotten pasture. The Ducks have been forgettable these last couple of seasons, and their accidentally dormant off-season suggests a little will change this year as everyone tools up around them. How long will Ducks fans remain patient with Verbeek remains to be seen. The Ducks are a D tier, but D+, because they have a solid prospect pool and have a ton of cap space moving forward. Just don't expect them to compete this year. Headed into last season as Stanley Cup champions, there were many questioning if the ruthless Kelly McCrimmon method of roster building was the way forward in the cap crunch era. Fast forward 12 months on, and having already alienated the wider NHL fandom with the continued use of LTIR loopholes, and even certain quarters of the VGK fanbase are losing patience with a GM who shows absolutely zero loyalty to his players. Let's be serious, we all know hockey is a business. But the stories emerging around the Marchessault contract, the heavy backloading and the disconnect is poor work when you're talking about your leading goal scorer. And Marchessault subsequently decided to look for options elsewhere and heralded an exodus of players at free agency such as Stevenson, Carrier, Manfa, Amadio and Martinez, totaling over 200 points of output. Talk was Vegas was shaping up to sign Stamkos, which obviously didn't come to pass, and Victor Olofsson was the only player of note signed in to plug the dam. That would be fine if you had a slew of prospects in the pipeline, but prospects and picks have been part of the ultra-aggressive McCrimmon approach to the market. Couple that with the Golden Knights drafting Trevor Connolly, possibly the least likeable option with the most baggage in the first round, and who has done little to improve his image since coming into the franchise through his interviews, and it's all a bit yikes in Vegas. Why would a player want to uproot his family and sign for a club they could be punted out from at any second? Nothing could have emphasised this more poignantly than Logan Thompson being traded 15 minutes before an autograph session at the Vegas-held draft. Thompson, to his credit, showed up and met with VGK fans in what turned out to be a farewell session. There's even been rumblings that the coach Bruce Cassidy was losing the locker room at the end of last season. The Hurdle signing at deadline irked NHL fans because it was predicated on Mark Stone's LTIR cap relief. Let's get one thing straight. Stone was injured, and both Stone and Eichel, two players the Knights will depend upon with the departure of Marchessault, are injury prone, and Hurdle himself was unable to play right away due to injury. Vegas and McCrimmon are paying the price for the approach to team building, and while it won them a cup, the act has gotten old fast. VGK are still a young franchise, and nosediving into mediocrity would not benefit the franchise even with their cup. But I don't see a lot to like, and many Golden Knights fans feel the same. I'm gonna give the vibes an F. I really don't like the direction of this team right now. Few teams can boast the kind of depth in scoring the Dallas Stars can, and there is even more on the way, with Logan Stankoven likely to improve, Maverick Bourque set to make the jump to the NHL, and Wyatt Johnson on the verge of stardom. But with all that said, it has been a disappointing offseason for Dallas and Jim Nill, who's barely put a foot wrong in his 11 years leading the Stars front office. While the retirement of Joe Pavelski is more than likely to be absorbed by the forward core, the loss of Chris Tanev on the blue line has been felt keenly in Dallas. Tanev was huge for the Stars this postseason, and few players are as perfectly built for playoff hockey as Chris Tanev. Dumba and Lyubushkin are poor replacements for Tanev, although Dumba may thrive in a more competitive environment, and they still have Heiskanen and Harley, who are amongst the best defensemen in the league. Still, all eyes will be on J.D. Oettinger on nights the Stars can't outscore their opponents. Oettinger had periods of struggle last season, but fortunately for him, those nights are likely to be few, with 7 forwards returning off the back of 20-plus goal campaigns last season. Re-signing Matt Duchene for a cap-friendly, pour one out, $3 million was a nice bit of business for Nill, and will only further bolster a team with 3 potent lines. It would be almost inconceivable if this Stars team didn't win a cup sooner rather than later, and the remarkable thing is, like the Red Wings of the early 2000s, the Stars keep pulling diamonds out in the depths of the draft to perpetually extend their window. Had Tanev re-signed, I'd have given the Stars S-tier grades, the superb Sparrows of the NHL. But the wobbly back end gives Maple Leafs of last season vibes. Despite that, I'm still going to give the Stars an A. Whether this season or the next few, this Stars team should win a cup, but they will need a Tanev-esque deadline pickup if it is to be this year, and that might require cashing in some of their future. So were the cap dumps of Jake Wallman and Robbie Fabry to help clear space for the upcoming contract negotiations with Lucas Raymond and Moritz Seider, or did Wallman and Fabry depart to free up space for Jacob Trouba? Because depending on who you ask, the answer is both. Raymond and Seider are unquestionably 2 of the most important pieces for the Red Wings moving forward, but with nothing tangible returning after Wallman was traded to San Jose, the off-season has been a big shrug for a team who narrowly missed a wildcard berth and elongated their playoff drought to 8 years. The Little Caesars Arena has still yet to host a playoff game, and it's difficult not to see Yzerman's work this past off-season as anything but a backstep. Indeed, we are now years deep into the Yzer plan: draft, develop, compete, mature and lead. And current RFAs Seider and Raymond and Dylan Larkin and Michael Rasmussen form an excellent core. Marco Kasper is an exciting young talent who looks set to graduate the Yzer plan, and Simon Edvinsson is a bona fide prospect. But the accumulation of 4 mediocre goaltenders is baffling, with Jack Campbell and Cam Talbot signed alongside ex-stint goalies Alex Lyon and Sebastian Kosa, and is kind of indicative with the restless sense of malaise coalescing around the Yzer plan. Few would be given the leash Steve Yzerman has had, but how much longer will Red Wings fans want to wait to compete? Is the Yzer plan moving forward? Prior to the beginning of this drought in 2016, you'd have to go all the way back to 1990 to find a year the Red Wings didn't make the postseason. Dylan Larkin has become such a linchpin of this team that when he was injured, the Red Wings went 4-10 with Larkin out of the lineup. The Red Wings have to get better when missing key pieces. Many wondered if Patrick Kane would be able to return from hip resurfacing surgery. Instead, he came back an almost point-a-game player. He may have become an elder statesman of the game, but re-signing Kane was a boon this off-season for Detroit. Despite the good vibes around Kane, I'm struggling to give the Red Wings a D-. I suspect a backstep this year and another year of mediocrity, and I also think this may be the season Red Wings fans begin losing patience. The NHL is always stratified. There are a number of teams outside contention. There are varying stages of a curve to reach competitiveness. Some would say the first years of a stripped-to-the-studs rebuild are the worst, like San Jose last year. Others would say the years mired in the mushy middle, such as what Calgary or Minnesota experienced, were the most depressing. But Pittsburgh, like their divisional rivals the Islanders, are perhaps in the bleakest place. Aged beyond contention and at that rudderless stage of pre-rebuild, Kyle Dubas seems wedded to core 4s. In Toronto it was Marner, Matthews, Tavares and Nylander, 4 players whose average age was 27.5 when he departed at a cost of $40.6 million a year. In Pittsburgh, Dubas has inherited a core of Crosby, Malkin, Letang and Erik Karlsson. While he inherited the 2005 alumni, Karlsson was his hire. While this core only costs $31 million a year, they also average 36.5 years and are, with the exception of Crosby and Carlson, beginning to show signs of wear and tear. Beyond the off-colour play of Malkin and Letang, the core four represents the vanguard of one of the NHL's oldest rosters. Indeed, their ages combined, the core four would be older than the league itself, and with most of the high-end talent tied up in the oldest players, points and production are unlikely to soar. Couple that with an unconvincing tandem of Jarry and Nedeljkovic in net, and it's hard to see the Penguins making a realistic push for the playoffs. Losing Jake Gensel was indicative of a team on a downward spiral, and rumours swirled around Sidney Crosby no less. Some Penguins fans are now comparing this Pens team with the 2021 Blackhawks, a team with an aging Taves and Kane that went 28, 42 and 12. At one point last season, Mike Sullivan was reportedly at loggerheads with Kyle Dubas regarding his coaching team. Unsurprising when the Penguins posted an awful 15.3 power play, and this was at times considerably worse. Free agency has been a ragtag of depth signings. Anthony Beauvillier is on his 5th team in 3 seasons. Gretzlik and Aho are unlikely to add much offense from the blue line, while Hayes and Lizotte come in off the back of poor seasons. The Pens were ultimately the team to pull trigger on Jets one-way Rutger McGrotty, who immediately signed a pro ELC with Pittsburgh. It'll be interesting to see how players like McGrotty and Gauthier will be handled, and whether McGrotty is a spearhead for an oncoming rebuild. For now, he makes the Pens younger, but will need time to adapt to NHL hockey. This team is going to look markedly different in a few years' time, but I suspect none of those years will be especially competitive. The sun is setting on the Crosby, Malkin and Letang era, and the twilight is only going to get darker in Pittsburgh whether Dubas or Sullivan survives the season or not. I'm going to give Pittsburgh an E. Whichever side of the fence you sit on regarding the hiring of Stan Bowman to replace Ken Holland, you cannot escape the feeling it is an odd choice. To come within a game of ending the Canadian Cup drought and all the goodwill that garnered from the less partisan Canadian hockey fans, the discourse now surrounding the team is Stan Bowman and what could happen if the Oilers come out the gates as slow as last season. And that's without even touching on Bowman's terrible history with trades. Much like in Chicago, Bowman has landed on a team primed for cup success. He's been given a Lamborghini with the keys in the ignition. The Oilers enter the season as bookmakers' favourites and are expected to follow the path Florida followed by entering the seasons as bridesmaids and leaving as brides. As Game 7 losers, the Oilers have lost little of the team through post-season subtraction, but Victor Arvidsson and Jeff Skinner have gained 2 intriguing pieces. Arvidsson, arguably one of the biggest free agency pickups that didn't land in Tennessee. What they did lose, through offsheets no less, in Dylan Holloway and Philip Broberg is not on paper a massive loss. However, what it represented to a fanbase is a larger concern. Things hadn't panned out with Cody Ceci, but shifting his contract seemed to open up cap space for at least matching on Holloway. Now that back end looks exceptionally thin, and Vasily Podkolzin, acquired from Vancouver, has not come close to fulfilling his potential, yet is being marked as the de facto replacement for Holloway. Who will pair with Darnell Nurse is another big question. Outside the drama in the front office and offer sheets, the biggest contract concern is Leon Draisaitl. The German looks primed to re-sign for what would be near a league maximum in both term and salary, which beggars the question how the Oilers will square their core three of Draisaitl, McDavid and Bouchard down the road and remain competitive. It's hard to predict what the long-term effects of blowing a Game 7 will be for Edmonton after coming all the way back. The Panthers shrugged off their cup final loss last season, but they also never looked close to winning in the finals they did lose. And is Jeff Skinner truly cursed to never play a playoff game? Questions are also likely to hound Stuart Skinner, who had an up and down season and playoffs. Although it is worth remembering that at 25, Skinner is young for an NHL starting goalie and has demonstrated remarkable resilience under scrutiny. The Bowman hiring and the ramifications of the offer sheet losses drops Edmonton to a B- vibes-wise. It's poor optics and comes at a time when there is much contract uncertainty with Edmonton's biggest pieces. The Canucks entered 2023-24 on the same odds as St. Louis, Seattle and the Islanders and had worse odds than the Ottawa Senators. Yet Vancouver entered the final month in President's Trophy contention and ultimately finished with the third best record in the West. The Canucks' unexpected success wasn't built on major swings, but rather incremental improvements from the front office all the way into the coaching staff and the minutiae of the special teams. But it was also predicated on players overperforming and the team remaining remarkably healthy until Demko went down in the postseason. Brock Besser went from a 40-50 point player to a 73-point, 40-goal scorer with a remarkable and unsustainable shooting percentage. Meanwhile, Thatcher Demko posted career numbers last campaign, but also dealt with a knee injury, which is a concern for a player who underwent major hip surgery early in his career. Arturs Shilovs emerged in the playoffs as a solid foil for Demko and earned his promotion over Casey DeSmith. The Canucks will likely need Shilovs to continue his playoff form to give Demko opportunities to rest. The Canucks' defense was deftly rebuilt last season and bolstered by the likes of Ian Cole and Nikita Zadorov, and was crucial in improving the Canucks' penalty kill. Both are now gone, replaced in free agency with PK specialist Derek Forbort and Vincent Descharnais, which seems like a downgrade 5-on-5. Jake DeBrusk was the big pickup in free agency, signed alongside former Boston teammate Danton Heinen and former Boston teammate Derek Forbort. Meanwhile, both Zadorov and Elias Lindholm had signed back in Boston. It was effectively a trade executed through free agency and one that on paper favours the Bruins. Behind the scenes, Rick Tockett's staff has been turned over with Mike Yeo leaving for Ottawa. Yeo reportedly wanted to be close to home, but in losing Yeo, the Canucks likely lost the most senior voice after Tocchet. Elias Pettersson ended last season in a meek state, and it was later revealed he was struggling with a knee injury. The Canucks will need the Pettersson of 2023 rather than 2024 if they're to come anywhere near the form of last season. I don't expect the Canucks to regress out of the playoffs this year, but I also don't expect them to win the Pacific either. While the weaker teams in the West have tooled up, the strongest teams seem to have slightly declined, and if the Canucks don't challenge with the Oilers, they could find themselves in a wildcard battle. See vibes, everything's a bit meh in Vancouver. It was always going to be hard to keep the band together after lifting the cup, but for the burgeoning fan base it was a mission accomplished. So long one of the most irrelevant franchises in the NHL, the ascendancy of the Panthers has been rapid under Bill Zito. Having made a cup final within the first few years, the rapid decline and subsequent mediocrity almost run hockey out of town. Now the Panthers need to enter a period of consolidating a core fanbase for the lean years that will eventually befall all franchises. Florida entered free agency with just 14 players signed into next season and managed to retain their most notable UFA, Sam Reinhart, who blew up for 57 regular season goals. He re-signed alongside Dmitry Kulikov, but the Panthers also shed a ton of talent, especially on the back end where both Brandon Montour and Oliver Ekman-Larsson departed. They also lost depth character players in Ryan Lomberg and Kevin Stenlund. Re-signing Anton Lundell was an important move as the Panthers now look toward their younger players to take a more active role. Bobrovsky, meanwhile, will be 35 next season and has had his ups and downs. The Russian was excellent last year and will have to be behind a thinner blue line and less tested backups with the departure of Anthony Stolarz. I don't expect Florida to regress massively this season, but it felt like last year was a must-win season. The window hasn't closed, but it's much less open than it was last year, and Bill Zito seems to have adopted a transitory attitude to the Florida contracts chart post-Cup. Still with the likes of Matthew Tkachuk and Sam Bennett on their roster, Florida are going to be tough to beat, and how much better can the vibes be than lifting the championship banner into the rafters for the very first time? B+. Last year, the San Jose Barracuda were one of the worst teams in the AHL. For teams competing in the NHL doing all their work through trades and free agency such as the Vegas Golden Knights, that wouldn't be a huge concern. But for a team in a strip-to-the-suds tear-down rebuild, a weak AHL team is a grave concern. So it is remarkable the work Mike Grier has managed to do this offseason with a team that put up early 90s expansion numbers last campaign. Obviously the big news was the drafting of long-touted number 1 Macklin Celebrini, who grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area. Celebrini is perhaps not the generational talent Bedard is in Chicago, but Celebrini is a star center who San Jose can build around. Will Smith, who lit up college hockey last year, will make the step up this season, marking 2 superb teenage talents making the jump to pros. And with Mikael Granlund coming off a strong season on an abysmal Sharks team, San Jose looked to be exceptionally solid through the middle. while Zetterlund and Eklund will likely make steps forward this year. Signing up journeyman Tyler Toffoli as a bankable foil for Celebrini was a nice piece of work. A 4-year deal means Toffoli can finally unpack his suitcase after 5 teams in 5 years. Wennberg and Gaudreau are neat depth pickups. While Wennberg struggled after a trade deadline move to the Rangers, Gaudreau, who returns to where his career started, had an excellent postseason in New York. Blackwood and Vanacek, however, looked like an absolute bomb scare pairing, and while Jake Woolman marginally improves the blue line, the D-core is either past-it vets or inexperienced rookies. And with that goaltending tandem, expect the Sharks to ship goals like crazy this season. The acquisition of Yaroslav Askarov was another great pickup for Greer, and in a position the Sharks desperately needed to improve. Askarov is untested, however, and has eccentric mechanics, and even with Cody Ceci coming in, which may or may not be an improvement, Askarov is going to face a baptism of fire behind that Sharks defense, and I would be surprised if he is given the reins straight out of the gates. That said, Askarov didn't want to wait forever for his chance in Nashville, and he now has the opportunity as a core component in a big rebuild. Much as fellow abject conference rivals Chicago have done, the Sharks have tooled up, but the emphasis in San Jose has been on blue chip prospects and youth. The Sharks feel like they've made giant strides over last season, and while, like the Hawks, I expect them to be adrift come April, I also expect the Sharks to be a more competitive and watchable team and give fans a reason to return to the Shark Tank. C+. On August 29th, the hockey world lost Johnny and Matthew Gaudreau. Even weeks later, it feels like an inconceivable loss. To lose 2 young men who truly exuded the joy of playing hockey and battled the adversity of their size to make it in the sport, and in Johnny's case at the highest level, in such tragic circumstances, is beyond comprehension. As an undersized guy myself, I always pull for small hockey players, and Johnny Hockey will be remembered amongst the greats. Johnny and Matthew leave a hole in the hockey world far bigger than their diminutive selves and their massive personalities. As a franchise, Columbus has had to deal with a heartbreaking amount of tragedy in its short life, and once again the Blue Jackets have to enter a season off the back of losing a teammate far too soon. This is what the result can be when you get behind the wheel of a vehicle drunk. 2 innocent and talented men leaving behind partners, friends and teammates, and children who will grow up without them, and your own life ruined. Don't drink and drive. There are plenty of better options, and if you do, you're a selfish arsehole. The league's perennial clown car continued their cavalcade of fails last year by trying to work a reclamation job on Mike Babcock, only for Babcock to turn out to be a proper wrong'un and get himself sacked before ever coaching a game. That left-field old boys club hiring turned out to be the effective last straw for Jarmo Kekalainen, who would find himself out the door before season's end. The Finnish GM's tenure had been remarkably long given the paucity of success and lack of direction during his incumbency, and the successor to Babcock did little to steady a ship which, in his defence, had already taken on a dangerous amount of water before he was ever given the helm. Still, with a talented prospect pool, questions had to be asked why Vincent was so reluctant to give ice time to the youngsters on a team that was never going to compete anyway. That decision set many players back on their development, while Vincent continued to dress parts and pieces that will not form the backbone of future Blue Jackets teams. Patience with Vincent inevitably ran out, with a front office at the time being steered by the director of hockey ops, John Davidson, and after a somewhat troubled search for a new head coach, Dean Everson was hired as a, let's be honest, second option after Todd McClellan fell through. Everson is a steady veteran hand who demands accountability and has surely been told he must start blooding the Blue Jackets prospects by new GM Don Waddell. And he has a pool of talent acquired over years of futility that could be the bones of an excellent team, with the likes of Caden Lindstrom, Denton Matejchuk, and Gavin Brindley likely to contribute alongside Adam Fantilli and David Jiricek soon. The Jackets desperately need a star goaltender to backstop this new wave though, and Boone Jenner shouldn't be playing top-line minutes. It came as little surprise that Patrick Laine moved on. Considering how he was MIA for most of last season, the franchise has had plenty of time to move on emotionally. Whatever demons caused Laine to be on such a downward curve, it was probably best for all involved that the Finn moved on. Laine's legacy will be more cap headroom for the Blue Jackets moving forward. The winds of change have finally swept through Columbus, but can the Blue Jackets go a season or two without stepping on any more rakes? I'll give Columbus a C. The Hawks were a train wreck last year, but that was kind of the point. They just hadn't banked on the Sharks being so abject as well. But Connor Bedard's inevitable Calder Trophy season gave fans a reason to show up to watch a horrible team. There were times when Bedard was injured that the Hawks looked little better than an AHL roster, and that losing mentality did nothing to benefit the genuine prospects getting ice time in the NHL. It was obvious that Chicago wouldn't tolerate another year of dire hockey, and the Hawks busily assembled a group of veterans to bolster the Hawks roster this offseason. Now older, a kind of peculiar tact for a rebuilding team, ice time is going to be at a premium for the foundation stone youngsters Kyle Davidson is envisioning building the Hawks around. However, with the Central Division in particular tooling up, bringing in the likes of Martinez, Teravainen, Brody, Bertuzzi and Maroon will make the Hawks more competitive and maybe help breed a winning mentality in Chicago. That said, these veterans are unlikely to move the needle much compared to their divisional rivals, particularly with the points gulf they have to make up, but they should at least be more watchable. Mrazek will now be backed up by Laurent Brossoit, which is a sneaky good pickup, and Seth Jones is now pound for pound not the worst contract in the NHL by some metrics. Jones looked much improved paired with Alex Vlasic last season. There's talk that the Hawks are going to bestow the C on Connor Bedard, which for me that would be premature, and Nick Foligno would be a much better role model for Bedard when he inevitably assumes the captaincy. But right now Bedard needs to focus on his game unfettered by leadership responsibilities. Maybe this seems a little off-piste, but I'm giving the Hawks a C+, with the caveat that they have to start blooding prospects. In a team where losing actually means something, I still expect them to be adrift by April next year, but this is due to the strength of their division, not their vibes. Rob Blake is operating on a short leash. Fans are disgruntled in LA and dissent has been growing louder for over a year now. A weak off-season has seen names like Matt Roy and Victor Arvidsson depart, with only Warren Foegele a notable acquisition. Subsequently, all eyes are on Quentin Byfield. Byfield had a breakout season last year playing on the wing, but is expected to shoulder more responsibility as a second-line centre this campaign. How that affects his production that skyrocketed to 20 goals and 35 assists remains to be seen. Indeed, as Kopitar and Doughty enter the late autumns of their career, the Kings need all their youngsters to improve, so the ongoing dispute with Arthur Kaliev does little to engender faith. Kaliev has requested away and has been poorly deployed, and this has seen his production tumble as a result. Kaliev is a pure sniper who has been consistently criticised for his lack of defence. Players being poorly deployed has become a theme under Blake and Todd McClellan. A dire run of form at the turn of the calendar saw McClellan binned off and his assistant Jim Hiller promoted to the hot seat. Hiller seemed to stabilise the Kings, who limped into the postseason, and this was enough for Hiller to get the gig full-time. It could be a case of be careful of what you wish for, as Hiller's first full term has the potential to be a baptism of fire if Byfield's production drops off, and youngsters such as Alex Laferriere and Brant Clark don't develop as expected. The team is likely to be left exposed by a mediocre tandem in net. Blake did at least manage to dispose of the Pierre-Luc Dubois contract, ending a disastrous saga for the Kings. With many of their top prospects already graduated, the Kings haven't got much left in the pipeline. Meanwhile, an indecisive GM is sleepwalking the Kings into muddy mediocrity. I expect the Kings to struggle for a wildcard place this year and for dissent to grow louder still around Rob Blake. It's looking a little grim in Los Angeles. I'm going to give them an E. Few teams pivoted from their plan this offseason, and none as hard as Nashville. When you take 3 of the biggest names off the free agency board immediately, it's bound to cause a stir. Much like me, the Preds seem to improve notably when not being subjected to U2, and the run of form Nashville experienced after the Vegas trip was cancelled seemed to be enough for Barry Trotz to reassess where the Preds are. Bringing in Steve Stamkos, Jonathan Marchessault and Brady Shea for a combined $108 million also sees Trotz inject the Preds with 95 goals if they can match their numbers from the previous campaign, and will surely improve the Preds' power play. Signing up UC Saros on an 8-year $7.7 million AAV contract was another major step. Saros enters 2024 off the back of one of his weakest NHL seasons, and even then he was still 5th in Vezina voting. The addition of Stamkos, Marchessault and Shea could be seen as additions to bolster Saros in his prime years, with an aging Roman Josi reaching the twilight of his career. There are those who will balk at the terms of the deals signed that will fear the Preds will be handcuffed in a few years, and they may be. This is an old team now, but Trotz has blown open what looked to be a closed cup contention window, and he's done so without cashing in picks and prospects. There could be a pretty big cliff in the next few years, but these next few years are likely to see the Preds right back in contention when they look like a team in retrograde. B+. The Bruins have been rock solid for years now. In the last 5 years, no team has a better record than the Bees. It's not even that close. The Avs are the closest at 15 points back. Part of that stability the last few years has been the bromance between Linus Ullmark and Jeremy Swayman, which came to an end with Ullmark departing for Ottawa this summer. Korpisalo came back from Ottawa, who is hot off a disastrous season in Sunderland. Will Korpisalo give Swayman the kind of William M. Jennings relief Ullmark did? Zadorov was as Boston a pickup the Bruins could manage, and comes in after a virtuoso playoffs in Vancouver, and now comes back east to haunt the Leafs, who failed to secure the Russian signature last year. One big question is how far apart Boston and Swayman are, who, entering mid-September, still haven't put pen to paper on a contract extension, which suggests there's a worrying distance to breach. The two parties avoided arbitration, so there are reasons to be optimistic, but the lingering contract talks suggest Swayman is feeling lowballed, and goaltending has been the backbone of this Bruins team. Picking up Elias Lindholm from Vancouver bolsters the Bruins down the middle, a position the Bruins had failed to address following the retirement of Patrice Bergeron. Lindholm is no Bergeron, but he will strengthen the spine of the Bruins offense. Boston will be adamantine solid again this season, particularly at the back, but questions remain where the goals are coming from and whether Korpisalo can rekindle his LA form to shore up Swayman. I'd be remiss if I didn't give the Bruins a B, but will they overcome the playoff hurdle or just remain a very good regular season team? Are the Flames rebuilding? This feels like it should be an easy question to answer, and yet the Flames haven't yet really committed to the bit. Do the Flames need to strip it down to the studs? Maybe. Aiming for a half and half only guarantees the Flames stay one of those muddy middle teams incapable of moving on, although they are shifting slowly backwards. Maybe this is just me as an outsider who hasn't paid a ton of attention to the Flames of late, but Calgary seem a little rudderless and without character. Part of the issue is the massive anchor Jonathan Huberdeau's contract has become. The last few years have seen cup-worthy names like Tkachuk, Markstrom and Tanev all move on to pastures new, and left the Flames hollowed out. The fallout between the Flames and Oliver Shillington's camp saw another piece depart, and there are rumours that Nazem Kadri is unhappy with the state of the Flames roster. Calgary had a strong draft, but that help isn't coming anytime soon. With Markstrom away to New Jersey, the path is now clear for Dustin Wolf to demonstrate he can be the number one. Wolf is a legitimate prospect and has been fantastic these last 2 seasons in the AHL, but I question how playing in front of a mediocre to poor Flames team will help his development or confidence. Mark Savard was lauded as a strong powerplay coach in St. Louis, but last year Savard's Flames powerplay was absolutely rotten. Did Savard have the tools in Calgary? He certainly will in Toronto, and it'll be interesting to see how both teams fare on the man advantage. There are Flames fans hopeful for the upcoming season, but I don't see it. I see a team in retrograde, steep retrograde. I expect Calgary will have a difficult year and prompt a full and recognisable shift towards a rebuild next season in a stacked Western Conference. For now, it's a D-. The Seattle Kraken made the playoffs in the franchise's sophomore season off the back of a phenomenal 11.6% shooting percentage, led by the likes of 40-goal scorer Jared McCann. Last season, McCann failed to hit 30, and youngsters like Matty Beniers seemed to regress under Dave Haxtell. From one of the best shooting percentages to one of the worst, Haxtell reportedly lost the dressing room and then his job. The Kraken were probably never a playoff team in the first place, pasting together a team of expansion draft scraps, with the league's other franchises unwilling to give up what they did to Vegas, and they entered 2023-24 overhyped on unsustainable statistics. Shane Wright is a rookie who is going to need help, but it's hard to see where that help is coming from. Ron Francis brought in Chandler Stevenson and Brandon Montour, solid signings on bloated contracts in both term and salary. Francis seems to be steadily building a workman-like team, but 4 lines of third liners isn't going to improve the club. The Kraken are very much victims of their own second-year success. Building an expansion team is traditionally hard work, and Kraken fans may be wondering why they couldn't repeat what Vegas did. Ultimately, Francis hasn't got the parts and pieces to make a big trade unless he banks the future and trades away the likes of Wright, Catton, Bernier or Tolvanen, and nobody wants to see that. In Dan Bylsma, the Kraken now have a cup-winning coach, but the road had been rocky in recent years for Bylsma before steering the Coachella Valley Firebirds to a 46-15-6 record last season. While there is some young talent in Seattle, many come with big question marks regarding their development, and the roster assembled around them screams turgid hockey. With stories emerging about dwindling enthusiasm in Seattle already, the vibes feel decidedly bad around the young franchise. I've got to say a D-. It may seem odd to say this for a team coming off the back of a President's Trophy season, but the Rangers have to be in win-now mode. Their window is rapidly closing. Why? Well, the Rangers enter 24-25 in contract seasons for K'Andre Miller and, more importantly, Igor Shesterkin. Shesterkin is widely regarded as the best goalie in the league and certainly one of the most consistent. He is likely to demand more than the $5.65 million he currently earns. Couple that with an aging forward core of Kreider, Zibanejad and Panarin, all north of 30, which could influence Shesterkin when he comes to the table, and the Rangers need to get it done this year. The Rangers could still use help in their top six at right wing, and Ehlers is one name that is being courted attention by the Blue Shirts, but it would likely take a Lafreniere or an Offman to pry him away from the Jets before trade deadline. Lafreniere is also entering a contract season, having been bridged out of his ELC and spent last year beginning to show the potential that saw him drafted first overall. Depending on how this season goes, there will be big questions surrounding Lafreniere and just how big a piece he could be for the Rangers when Kreider, Zibanejad and Panarin all age out. Bigger questions remain around Kaapo Kakko, who seemed to stagnate and stall out last year. His health issues are well documented, but his trade value seems to have greatly diminished, and that in a nutshell is the biggest concern for the Rangers. Neither Kakko nor Lafreniere have flourished, leaving nearly all the heavy lifting to the old core, who never got it going during the Eastern Conference Finals. Indeed, Kreider, Panarin and Zibanejad combined for just 2 goals in the 6-game series. Is this Rangers team built for the marathon of the playoffs? The Rangers did little in free agency and essentially enter the season older and unchanged, aside from the waived departure of Barclay Gaudreau and the addition of 33-year-old Riley Smith and Sam Carey. The Rangers are bound to be solid in the regular season, but they feel a half step back from where they were a year ago and could take a step further back again. I'm gonna give them a C. As the remotest outpost of the NHL, Winnipeg has always struggled, perhaps more than any other Canadian team, to attract and retain players. Even before Rutger McGrorty departed without signing an ELC, rumours abounded that Nikolai Ehlers would not re-sign in Winnipeg, placing the unique challenges of the Jets in stark contrast. With that said, Ehlers has other reasons to feel frustrated. Rick Bowness has retired after a great career, but toward the end of his time in Winnipeg, Bowness seemed to be a man out of ideas, badly utilising the tools at his disposal. Only a Georgiev TM-esque display in the playoffs saved the Jets from being swept. It was a marked flatlining after such a strong start to last season, predicated largely on the Vezina caliber displays of Connor Hellebuyck. Hellebuyck was manfully aided by Laurent Brossoit last term, but Brossoit is gone, and it will be Kaapo Kakkonen or Eric Comrie that will provide relief, and both are distinct downgrades. The season began to unspool when Kyle Connor began to struggle. Lines were juggled, but the Jets simply looked slow and lost. Scott Arniel has inherited a puzzle with what to do with his top 6. Free agency was unsurprisingly quiet as the Jets struggled to bring players in at the best of times and is indicative of a market that struggles to retain competitive momentum. Brendan Dillon left and some extra goalies were added. RFA Cole Perfetti remains unsigned, which is a massive priority for Kevin Cheveldayoff. It's impossible to grade vibes in Winnipeg without mentioning the arrival of Gary Bettman last year. While many will cite his warnings around attendance as the Commissioner's ongoing hatred of Canada, the fact was many Jets fans were feeling disenfranchised by how ticketing and game day experience were being managed. Winnipeg would perhaps be viewed less of an outpost if they stopped acting like one and appeased their fanbase. As it is, if the Jets come out the gates like they ended last season, Scott Arniel may find himself out of work by Christmas, and fans will have even more reason to be gloomy. Winnipeg is on a constant sine wave and will live and die by Hellebuyck. I'm going to give them D because they had such a good season last year, but many players just don't want to be here, and in a salary cap league it's hard to figure out how the Jets can mitigate this. In compiling and researching this video, I listened to and watched a lot of team-specific shows and podcasts, and boy, do Blues fans have a chip on their shoulder about being the NHL's forgotten or most overlooked team. It's a concept which, as a Brit who grew up watching the President's Trophy winning Blues every other week in the late 90s because I had no other options, is kind of amusing. And it's particularly ironic because the contemporary Blues may have built one of the most directionless and forgettable rosters in the NHL. Like, the most overriding question is, what are the Blues' long-term plan? 6 years out from their first Stanley Cup, and the Blues have progressively regressed into the league's muddy middle, and they may be the weakest mid-tier team in the West. There are a handful of extremely serviceable 20-somethings in this Blues team, like Robert Thomas, Jordan Kyrou and Pavel Buchnevich, and with a stronger supporting cast, they would all be the types of players who could sit on cup-winning teams' top 6. But the drop-off from that core is dramatic. Jake Neighbours had a reasonably strong season in a very nothingy Blues team last term, and is really the only under 25-year-old Blues fans have reason to be excited. Even their prospects pool tracks decidedly mid-tier, with Snuggerud and Dvorsky the only two likely to be anything other than depth parts and pieces, and both unlikely to show up this year, although Snuggerud may be given a chance when the college season ends. The acquisition of Philip Broberg and Dylan Holloway through an unprecedented double offer sheeting certainly dragged the Blues out of obscurity in the dog days of summer. While neither will move the needle massively in the immediate, it presses the fast forward on the Blues retool and adds even more high-potential youngsters onto their roster. Depending on how this pans out, given the wild overpay on Broberg, Doug Armstrong, who was bullish on the move, may have paved a new way for GMs to approach offer sheets. It will likely change how safe GMs feel around their RFA contracts entering summer. Looking back, a mediocre start last season cost Cup winner Craig Berube his job, and Drew Bannister, a man who once coached my local team in Glasgow, Scotland, took the reins. Bannister certainly improved the Blues, earning his upgrade from interim to permanent, but Bannister's Blues were streaky and much of the fanbase felt the hire was a bit too safe and meh. Oddly enough, meh seems to be the prevailing feeling around the Blues. Everyone's favourite netminder Binnington showed flashes of his old self last season, and Hoffer is an exciting if slightly eccentric number 2, but neither is lifting the Blues from mediocrity alone. I guess I'm going to upset the chippy and forgotten Blues fanbase again, but this Blues team is utterly meh. They may compete for the playoffs, but that will be because of how stratified the Western Conference is. But moving forward, Armstrong needs to stamp some sort of identity on this team other than being the NHL's lost franchise. It will be interesting to see how his offer sheets turn out, but for me, D-tier vibes. Maybe it's the inbuilt pessimism of an Islanders fan, but there is little to be enthused about this iteration of the Isles. Despite steps taken by Patrick Roy, who entered the fray mid-season, this Islanders team is old, slow and worse, handcuffed by a lack of prospects and a lack of cap space. Under Lamoriello, the Islanders have consistently made the playoffs but haven't won a series in 3 years and never looked close against Carolina. Lamoriello has also consistently overpaid for contracts and traded away first-round draft picks for negligible returns. The upshot is an Islanders team in retrograde and an AHL affiliate that's the worst in the American League, rounded out by a prospects pool routinely voted the worst and only marginally improved by the selection of Cole Eiserman this offseason. With character players like Cal Clutterbuck and Matt Martin unsigned, the grinding depth the Islanders so frequently relied upon to energise the team is gone, save Casey Cizikas, and now the Islanders are wholly beholden to Sorokin and Varlamov. As good as Varlamov still is at 36, it was alarming to see Ilya Sorokin play understudy due to struggles. Having 2 world-class goalies is vital for a team with so little offensive threat. Anthony Duclair was a nice pickup to that end. The Islanders will be his 9th team in 10 seasons, so a 4-year deal gives him a chance to unpack his suitcase, although he also had to cut off his dreadlocks, which just Lou Lamoriello. Maxim Tsiplankov is an intriguing and highly touted player from the KHL, but he's also had only 1 solid year in the Russian League. Brock Nelson may be one of the most underrated players in the NHL, given he has been a consistent 30-goal scorer these last few years. But he would also make a prime target for a cup contender at the trade deadline, and as this is a contract year for the 32-year-old, it is maybe time for the Islanders to leverage some of their older players if they're outside of the playoffs come February. Indeed, this roster needs turning over. Is Lamoriello, who banked the future on expensive mediocrity, the man to tear it down, or does he want to just keep treading water in the league's mushy middle? At 81 years old, does he have the drive to start retooling? The Islanders will likely be the oldest team in the league this season, and Bridgeport the worst in the AHL. As an Isles fan, this pains me, but it's an E. I really think the vibes are some of the worst. When I started making notes for this video around trade deadline, the Capitals seemed like a team trapped in stasis by the pursuit of Wayne Gretzky's goal-scoring record by Alexander Ovechkin. With the apparent career-ending injury to Nicholas Backstrom, Washington looked resolved to just jury-rig as decent a supporting cast for Ovechkin as possible. When the Caps became sellers at trade deadline, it all felt like a precursor to a much larger rebuild. Yet somehow the Caps reached the playoffs despite an injury and trade deadline denuded and limited roster. This was enough to convince Brian McClellan and his now incumbent protege Chris Patrick to invest in the Capitals entering free agency, especially with the cap relief from Backstrom on LTIR and TJ Oshie potentially entering retirement. As such, the Capitals made a splash in free agency and prior when they made the eyebrow-raising trade to send Darcy Kemper to LA for radioactive enigma Pierre-Luc Dubois. Later pickups included Andrew Mangiapane and Jacob Chychrun in trades, and Matt Webb, Brandon Duhaime and Taylor Radish in free agency to completely retool the roster. Charlie Lindgren emerged as a starting goaltender last year and posted an excellent 9-11 in his first season as the main man. Logan Thompson will provide a serviceable backup or 1B. In fact, expect Lindgren and Thompson to effectively rotate. Connor McMichael enjoyed a breakout year in a more prominent role and will likely play wing with newcomer Dubois and Mangiapane, a line that will live and die by how Dubois plays. The Caps are a weird team, partly grafted together with some decent young pieces. They have solid enough back-end and goaltending, but questions remain on Dubois' application and whether we get pre or post All-Star Ovechkin out the gates. C. They will probably be fighting for a wildcard place amongst the Middle and Eastern Conference teams. Oh yes, here we go. It's Maple Leafs time. Will it be the 58th time's the charm for a team that hasn't won anything of note since the days of the original six? Can Austin Matthews continue to score at a 70-goal pace? No, probably not. Obviously, the biggest story surrounding the Leafs this offseason was the rumours swirling around Mitch Marner. As of August 13th, Marner remains a Leaf. There are elements surrounding Marner that will likely remain a distraction again this season, and questions will continue to be asked headed into a contract year, especially if he flatters to deceive. Tavares also heads into the season on a contract year, and at 33, Tavares will be expected to take a significant pay cut if he's continuing in Toronto beyond this season. His relinquishing of the captaincy to Austin Matthews, however graceful and classy, begs further questions. Part of me feels like the Leafs would be better served letting the two go or trading away to free up cap, because this core hasn't got Toronto anywhere near a cup. While the core four hoover up most of the oxygen around Toronto, the Leafs did upgrade their blue line, which was a significant weakness last term. The additions of Chris Tanev and Oliver Ekman-Larsson mean the Leafs' top two pairings are considerably beefed up, and while questions may be asked regarding the term for Tanev, Tanev is a player with post-season grit, something the Leafs have sorely lacked. While Hakanpää may never see the ice in blue, Tanev and OEL are a giant leap from the outgoing Brody, Edmondson and Lyubushkin. The Leafs still desperately need depth scoring, something that having over 60% of your spend on forwards wrapped up in 4 players is going to be hard to find, and wasn't helped by the exit of Tyler Bertuzzi. The current setup of the Leafs offers too few opportunities for young players to develop. I'm still not 100% sold on Wall. He's a promising goalie and at 26 still young for the position, but he always seems to have a mistake in him. As such, picking up Anthony Stolarz should help. Stolarz joins off the back of an extremely good season backing up Sergei Bobrovsky in Florida. Berube will be a markedly different coach than Keefe. Berube tended to prefer a strong, grinding 4-line rotation in St. Louis, which is something he won't get in Toronto. It'll be interesting to see how Berube deals with this roster makeup and the prima donnas it comes with. B vibes. They'll do what they always do with the core four, make it to the playoffs and at best win one series because they've improved their defense. The ultimate middlemen of the NHL, mediocrity personified. The Wild sacked Everson in November after starting the season 5-10-4 and was replaced by John Hines in a desperate effort to make their 11th playoff appearance in 12 seasons. Ultimately, it wasn't to be, as the Wild went 34-24-5 under Hines and landed 6th in the Central. That said, there were reasons to be cheerful in Minnesota. Brock Faber emerged as a possible contender for the Calder Trophy when Connor Bedard went down with a broken jaw, and the best bit of off-season business for Bill Guerin was signing Faber up to a league maximum 8-year term at just over $8 million a year. Indeed, Faber is one of a slew of Wild players on long-term contracts, somewhat handcuffing Guerin in the market, and this is made worse by the $14 million of cap currently retained in Zach Parise and Ryan Suter. That $14 million will all but drop off next season, but until then the Wild are somewhat treading water in a competitive division. And that was reflected in free agency, which was largely quiet for the Wild, but Zeev Buium falling to the Wild on draft day sets up the tantalising tandem of Faber and Buium in the near future, as Buium is expected to turn pro at the end of the college hockey season. With Matt Boldy continuing an upward trend towards a point-a-game type production, the Wild have a number of exciting young pieces. Still, until the Wild recoup that $14 million tied up in retained contracts, this season is likely to be a bridge year and another wasted year of Kaprizov at his peak. I expect the Wild to target their goaltending when that cap is freed up. Gustafsson was below .900 goalie last year, and an aging Flower had even worse numbers. Volstead has yet to show he's ready for the jump, although 3 games with 2 wins is a small sample size. Once Fleury retires and $14 million opens up in a year the cap increases, the Wild have to look to improve in net, and they should have the money to do it. The Wild will likely be there or thereabouts as always, so long as things improve in net. They'll also likely provide little challenge as always if they do make the postseason. Still, Boldy, Buium and Faber and cap opening up mean the Wild are actually a B for me. This year may be a big bag of meh, but there is light on the horizon. For all the talent perennial contenders the Colorado Avalanche have, they can never seem to escape the question mark in net. Alexander Georgiev, generally statistically solid, slumped beneath .900 for the second time in his NHL career last season, and was equally poor in the postseason. That's not to say everything can be laid at Georgiev's door. With so much cap tied up in Nathan MacKinnon and Cale Makar, and more cap in stasis for the possible return of Gabe Landeskog and Valery Nichushkin, the Avs sorely lack depth scoring, and it is this shortcoming that saw the hockey writers decry that the 24-25 Avs would not be contenders. The trade deadline signing of Casey Mittelstadt has certainly helped, but the question marks surrounding Landeskog and Nichushkin mean the Avs front office have their hands tied in terms of cap space. A Landeskog return would be pinnacle vibes, but the longer his absence goes on, the louder questions begin to be asked if Landeskog will ever be able to compete at the NHL level, let alone at the $7 million AAV he would return to. The Central Division will be stronger this season, and Avs haven't been able to move the needle much against their competition. It's a difficult task apportioning a grade to Colorado with so many pieces on the edge of the board. I'm going to give them a C because, short of Georgiev lighting up, I actually expect Colorado to be fighting more for wildcard places this season than for President's trophies. The biggest excitement for Sabres fans this offseason may have been the acquisition of a new scoreboard for the increasingly rundown KeyBank Center, who've had to endure grim hockey in one of the most rundown arenas for a third of my life. When I began compiling my notes for this list back in January, I was going to shoot for the stars with my spicy take on the Sabres, a team that clawed its way back into wildcard contention only to continue their now record-breaking 13-year playoff drought. I was planning on putting a dark horse bet on the Sabres to even win a playoff series, ending their 17-year drought of not winning a playoff series after their spirited, if ultimately futile, efforts to make the wildcard spots last season. They'd shown just how good they could be towards the end of the season, and the arrival of Bowen Byram seemed to bolster a blue line that boasts lots of offensive upside but severely lacks defensive nous. Byram isn't a stay-at-home D-man by any stretch, but did bring playoff acumen with him. D-men trying to step up into plays was a massive detriment last season for the Sabres. The young swords also tended to show a lack of compete when their backs were to the wall, and early goals would often lead to lopsided games. There were rumours that a country club atmosphere had set in the locker room, that many of the young'uns had stagnated under Granato. However, the off-season was unremarkable. Despite Kevin Adams really needing to win now, Adams seemed resistant to make the moves the Sabres required to step up and end their post-season drought. Buying out Jeff Skinner freed up cap space, and Jason Zucker may suck up some of the lost offense, but he isn't going to be a two-way forward any more than Skinner was. Binning off Granato to bring in Lindy Ruff is nothing short of a vibes move. Lindy had a rough time of it in New Jersey, and that team wasn't set up to play rough run and gun. Questions will remain if Ruff's style helps or hinders Ukko-Pekka Luukkonen. coming off a career year, and Levi struggled when behind a Sabres team that seemed to cough up an unusually high number of chances when the youngster was in the net. The signing of Reimer suggests the Sabres brass feels Levi needs more maturing in the AHL, but expect Levi to be given a chance if UPL regresses to the mean. I wanted to give the Swords a B so bad, but they feel like they've just stood pat, so a C it is. But there are a lot of promising youngsters in Buffalo. The problem is, it's creating a bottleneck in their system now. And so we finish as alphabetically imperfectly as we began with the Ottawa Senators. Pound for pound, they may have been the worst team in the league the last few seasons. They're the true embodiment of hockey not being played on paper, as on paper this Senators team should have been far better, and yet only seem to turn up when the season is over in low-calorie games. Abject goaltending was part of the problem out of the gates. The Sens could not buy a save and were cut adrift early, making for a protracted yet inevitable pre-Christmas sacking for DJ Smith. Made all the more worse when interim head coach Jacques Martin arrived to replace him weeks before as a Grim Reaper-esque advisor. With Korpisalo jettisoned in the deal that brought significant upgrade Linus Ullmark to Ottawa, and Travis Green now installed as the full-time bench boss, you would hope Ottawa were primed for improvement. But Ullmark has had his struggles at times when he was in Buffalo, and this Senators blue line is weaker than what he played behind as a 1B in Boston. Brady Tkachuk is entering his 7th season as an NHLer. Having watched his brother Matthew lead the Panthers to a cup, Brady has yet to ever play a playoff game. That led to some trade speculation regarding the club captain, which never materialised, and yet had it, that would have been a damning indictment of this era of the Sens. The Sens own the 14th most expensive roster in the league, which has to be the biggest head-scratcher after the Islanders in 5th. Considering the futility last season, it's difficult not to suggest the Senators haven't overpaid on contracts, and I'd argue it's not unfair to say, in its current state, this roster doesn't have the minerals to compete. Much of the Sens' off-season work was trade-based, swapping Jacob Chychrun for veteran defenseman Nick Jensen, shunting Matthew Joseph to join his brother in St. Louis, and signing David Perron, who can be reunited with Artem Zub, who he cold-clocked last season. Noah Gregor and Michael Amadio were also added to bolster depth. Outside of Ullmark and perhaps Perron, none of this feels like it moves the needle much, but swapping out a fair number of faces might clear out the country club culture that had set in. However, Travis Green comes with his own baggage from Vancouver when his tough love approach lost the Canucks dressing room. DJ Smith was perhaps too much of a feather touch. Green feels like an overzealous course correction with a club with some difficult personalities. I expect another hard year for the Sens, while many may predict they might do better. And if they do miss the playoffs, expect to get more trade rumours to surround their captain. I'm going to give D-tier vibes. And with that, all 32 teams in the AHL are graded. The vibes are filed for another year. Well, an inaugural year. And not a single S-tier team. I guess that's a product of the salary cap and my propensity to fence it. If you disagree, and I'm sure you do, please comment down below how much of an idiot I am. Are you a chippy St. Louis fan, feel the Broberg and Holloway offer sheets hoisted you from obscurity? Are you a Vegas fan and feel like I'm just another hater? And are you a Dallas Stars fan who thinks I've cursed you? This was a grading of vibes, and for 24-25, consider the NHL vibes graded. And hey, I guess if more than 6 people watch this, I might actually return to it next year. Keep your eyes peeled as I have another video coming up previewing the opening weekend and what to watch and what to not. And until then, I don't know, sit in a dark room and wait until that next video drops.